The ivory cane did not break. It simply found a new exit through Commodore Alistair's elbow. White bone shards, pulverized by the kinetic debt of a billion-ton iceberg, punched through his gold-trimmed sleeve in a spray of crimson mist. Alistair's jaw detached, his teeth shattered against his own tongue. The crowd of nobles on the deck of Her Majesty's ship Argent Mother did not have time to scream. They only heard the wet, mechanical sound of a human being turning into a collection of crushed minerals. The invincibility had ended. The bill had arrived. 2 hours earlier, the atmosphere on the upper deck was thick with the scent of gin and expensive lavender. Her Majesty's ship Argent Mother cut through the harbour, its silver-treated solwood hull gleaming with a synthetic holy radiance. Commodore Alistair leaned against the primary railing. His white-gloved hand gripped the ivory cane. A smirk occupied his face. Ahead, the jagged teeth reefs waited to shred any vessel made of mortal timber. Alistair did not order a turn. He signaled for maximum speed. He demanded the impossible. "Increase speed to 12 knots, Alistair commanded. His voice carried the sharpness of a whetted blade. "I want the hull to scrape the volcanic stone. I want the governor to witness a ship that exists above the laws of the ocean." The helmsman's hands trembled. Fear paralyzed the crew. But the Commodore's will was absolute. 40 feet below the waterline, the anchor chamber smelled of stagnant seawater and old mortality. No gears protected the solwood keel. Only a throne of rusted iron sat in the dark. A figure occupied the seat, wrapped from throat to ankle in salt-crusted grey bandages. He was the vessel. He was the contract carrier. A sharp vibration rattled the vessel's skull. The ancient blood ritual hummed. Alistair was ordering a direct collision for sport. The vessel opened his eyes. Flat, dead grey pools stared into the dark. The hull shrieked as solwood met volcanic rock at 12 knots. Under standard physics, the ship would have disintegrated. The contract intervened. The dynamic substitute protocol activated. Kinetic energy from 12,000 tons of ship hitting rock bypassed the timber. The solwood remained flawless. Not a single microscopic scratch appeared on the silver paint. The energy required a destination. The contract delivered it with absolute efficiency. The shockwave slammed into the iron throne. It channeled directly into the vessel's left arm. Crack! The sound was a dull detonation in the bilge. The vessel's humerus snapped. Muscle tissue seized. Localized blood supply vaporized under the pressure. Bone marrow seeped into his tattered bandages. Pain exceeded the 500% threshold. System status critical. He did not flinch. He did not gasp. Compliance was his only function. He leaned into the fracture, allowing his shattered arm to serve as a high-voltage conduit. He grounded the ship's debt within his own marrow. "As you wish, Commodore," the vessel whispered. The words were a dry rattle of shifting sand. Up on the deck, synthetic delight rippled through the guests. Her Majesty's ship Argent Mother had violated the reef, yet the champagne in the governor's glass remained motionless. Alistair barked a triumphant laugh. He descended the stairs toward the anchor chamber. His polished boots clicked rhythmically, marking time like a funeral drum. The hatch swung open. Cruel sunlight invaded the dark. Alistair stepped into the stench. His face twisted. He located the vessel, slumped in the iron throne. Blood seeped through the grey bandages. "You smell of rotting viscera, parasite," Alistair sneered. The ivory cane descended. Its heavy gold cap drove directly into the center of the vessel's fresh fracture. Alistair pushed. He twisted. The gold metal ground against exposed nerve endings and pulverized bone fragments. "Look at me, dog," Alistair hissed. He forced the vessel's gaze upward. "I want you to feel this. I want you to remember your place. Without my ship, you belong in the gutters. Instead, you get to be useful. Gratitude is the only emotion I permit you to possess." The vessel looked up. White-hot lightning surged through his brain. He did not pull away. He actively leaned forward, allowing the gold cap to sink deeper into his own ruined flesh. He reinforced the Commodore's dominance through absolute, agonizing obedience. "The ship is unharmed, Commodore," the vessel said. His voice possessed a terrifying, unyielding stillness. "Compliance at 100%. The temple is flawless." "As it should be," Alistair spat. He withdrew the cane with a violent yank, ripping the gold cap away from the wound. A smear of black blood remained on the ivory. Alistair wiped it directly onto the vessel's forehead. The ghost storm arrives tonight. We head for the maelstrom of shadows at full mast. I intend to fly through the gale at 20 knots. Do you understand, dog? I want no water on this deck. If I lose my balance even for a second, I will have your eyes flayed from your skull. The vessel felt the weight descending. The maelstrom was a graveyard. To stabilize a ship in those conditions meant absorbing the hydraulic force of 50-foot mountains of water. Your will is the ship's command, the vessel replied. The metaphysical wire of the contract tightened around his heart. The conductivity will be absolute. I will ensure you feel nothing. Midnight arrived. The sky turned the color of a fresh, deep tissue bruise. The maelstrom of shadows hit with a sonic roar that vibrated through every silver plank of Her Majesty's ship Argent Mother. Walls of black water, 50-foot high, slammed against the hull. This brine possessed the physical weight of falling mountains. On any other vessel, the primary masts would have disintegrated under the atmospheric torsion. The silver-treated soulwood would have yielded. The Argent Mother remained unnaturally steady. Inside the grand ballroom, the governor gripped the edge of a mahogany table. His knuckles possessed the pallor of a shroud. He watched his champagne. The golden liquid sat motionless. It did not ripple. It did not stir. The ship plummeted down the face of a massive swell, a drop that should have sent every soul on board tumbling into the bulkheads. The guests felt only a ghostly, horizontal slide. "This is not seamanship, Alistair," the governor whispered. His voice trembled against the roar of the gale. "This is a violation. The ocean screams for our blood. We should strike the sails. We are inviting a catastrophe." Commodore Alistair stood by the heavy glass windows. His white uniform glowed in the rhythmic flashes of violet lightning. He did not look at the governor. He looked at his own reflection in the glass. He saw a deity staring back. He adjusted his gold-embroidered cuffs. "The ocean screams because it has finally met its master," Alistair replied. The sound of his voice possessed the sharpness of a whetted blade. Catastrophe is a word for the weak, for men who sail in wooden tubs held together by prayer. My ship is held together by my will. I ordered 20 knots, and I will have 20 knots. Anything less is an admission of mortality. Alistair turned to the brass communication tube. He didn't just speak, he snarled. "Dog, I feel a shudder in the keel. A microscopic vibration. You are getting lazy in your filth. Tighten the connection. I want the deck to feel like solid granite. If I feel a single jolt from the next wave, I will come down there and personally remove your remaining teeth with my cane." 40 feet below, the vessel existed in a state of systematic demolition. A rogue wave hit the bow with the force of 9.8 tons of hydraulic pressure. The contract surged. The vessel's right femur detonated. The bone didn't just break, it became a collection of jagged white splinters. These shards shredded the surrounding muscle from the inside. He did not scream. He did not allow a single gasp to escape his throat. He channeled the kinetic energy. He dragged the vibration out of the soulwood and pulled it into his own marrow. His ribs began to cave in, one by one. Each wave was a rhythmic hammer blow. Crack, crack, crack. He sat in his rusted iron throne, a ruin of internal organs and pulverized calcium. His spleen ruptured under the torsion. Dark fluid began to fill the lower lobes of his lungs. Every breath became a wet, bubbling struggle. He did not lower the conductivity. He increased it. His mind expanded. He seized every stray vibration. He grabbed the thermal energy generated by the friction of the wind against the rigging. He reached for the structural stress in the mainmast. This was no longer a defensive act of substitution. This was a calculated harvest. He became a black hole of kinetic potential. Each blow from the maelstrom deposited energy into a metaphysical account. Alistair would eventually be forced to settle this debt in full. The contract pulsed in his skull. Searing white light filled his vision. System overload imminent. Substitution conductivity at 350%. The vessel gritted his crimson-stained teeth. Red static filled his eyes. "Not yet," he hissed into the darkness. "The Commodore desires perfection. I will give him a debt that cannot be repaid." A massive gust of wind, a localized vortex of pure atmospheric spite, caught the primary sail. The soulward mast groaned. It began to tilt. The wood started to shriek, a sound of imminent structural failure. Alistair's voice boomed through the tube, manic and drunk on his own perceived power. "Take the strain. I hear the wood complaining. Silence it. Take every ounce of the wind's anger into your meat. Do your job, you parasite." The vessel closed his eyes. He reached out with his mind and gripped the base of the mast through the contract. He opened his nervous system to the full torsion of the storm. His spine twisted. The vertebrae ground against each other with the sound of crushing gravel. 3 discs slipped. These discs pinched his spinal cord, sending white-hot sparks of artificial lightning through his entire body. His nervous system screamed. His heart hammered at 210 beats per minute. Each thump forced blood through a body that was more liquid than solid. The mast straightened. The groaning ceased. The Argent Mother cut through the heart of the maelstrom, a silent silver ghost navigating a world of chaos. Alistair laughed on the upper deck. He toasted the governor with his champagne. His ivory cane clicked a victory march against the deck. He had no suspicion that the man he called a dog was currently holding the entire ship together with his own shattered spine. The Commodore believed the invincibility was his own attribute. He believed the physics of the world had simply surrendered to his rank. The vessel smiled. A thick rope of blood escaped his lips and dripped onto the iron throne. The conductivity was now at 400%. He was no longer a buffer. He was a primed explosive. He felt the cold presence of the iceberg graveyard approaching in the mist. The kinetic debt was nearly large enough to vaporize a city. He waited for the moment Alistair would demand the ultimate performance. He waited for the ice. Her Majesty's ship Argent Mother roared through the freezing mist of the iceberg graveyard. Visibility dropped to 0. Ahead, a wall of ancient, jagged white rose from the black water. It was a billion-ton titan of unyielding, frozen stone. Any other captain would have executed an emergency turn. Any other captain would have surrendered to the ice. Commodore Alistair stood at the bow. His ivory cane gripped a hand that did not tremble. He looked at the governor. That man's skin possessed the grey pallor of a corpse. The Commodore let out a jagged, manic laugh. He did not order a change in course. He did not signal for reduced speed. "Witness the fragility of nature!" Alistair screamed into the gale. "My ship does not negotiate with the world. The world yields to my rank." He slammed the gold cap of his ivory cane against the silver deck. The vibration traveled down the solward masts. In the anchor chamber, the vessel felt the strike. It was no longer a command. It was a direct violation of the physical laws governing the universe. The contract pulsed. It became a blinding electric white in the vessel's mind. The conductivity redlined. 450%, 500%. The vessel's skin cracked under the strain. Blue light leaked from his pores. This radioactive steam hissed in the stagnant water of the bilge. His eyes were no longer grey. They were burning pits of pure, concentrated kinetic potential. "One final command, dog." Alistair's voice hissed through the communication tube. Contempt dripped from every syllable. "The iceberg. I want us to cut it in half. I want to feel the impact, and I want to feel nothing. If I drop my glass, I will have your eyes for my breakfast." The vessel took a ragged breath. His lungs were half filled with his own blood. He forced a smile. It was a terrifying, jagged expression. "As you wish, Commodore," he whispered into the dark. "I will make this the most efficient transfer in maritime history." He did not just accept the incoming force. He reached out and grabbed the very core of the blood ritual. He dialed the conductivity to 550%. He synchronized his nervous system with the molecular structure of the hull. He became the ship. He became the silver wood. He became the debt. Her Majesty's ship Argent Mother hit the iceberg at 22 knots. The sound was a dull thud. A silence so absolute followed that it felt as though the world had stopped breathing. For 1 microsecond, the entire mass of the ship, its weight, its speed, its momentum, met the immovable resistance of the billion-ton Titan. Up on the deck, Alistair braced himself. A sneer of false confidence remained frozen on his face. He expected the usual miracle. He expected the low-grade magic of his slave to swallow the blow. He expected to stand tall while the ice shattered into dust. He was wrong. In the dark below, the vessel felt the mountain of energy surge toward him. It was enough to level a coastal city. It was enough to vaporize an entire fleet. The energy entered his fingertips. It reached his heart, and then he let go. Snap. The sound was not wood breaking. It was not bone snapping. It was a mechanical crack that eclipsed the roar of the ocean. This metaphysical snap echoed in the marrow of every sailor on board. The vessel severed the tether at the exact apex of the impact. The kinetic energy had nowhere to go. It had been invited into the ship, but its designated host was no longer home. According to the law of equivalent exchange, the force had to return to its origin. It searched for the one who gave the order. It searched for the hand that held the cane. The Argent Mother remained pristine. Not a single silver plank splintered. The iceberg, hit by the sheer concentrated residue of the over-cooperation, exploded into a million shards of diamond dust. But on the deck, the silence died. Alistair did not even have time to scream. The impact of the iceberg, every single ounce of that mountain-shattering force, travelled up through the deck. It bypassed the silver wood. It found the ivory cane. From the cane, it surged into Alistair's arm. His white-gloved hand disintegrated. It did not blow off. It became a red cloud of mist and bone dust. The force continued its journey. It travelled through his shoulder and into his torso. His ribs turned into jagged shrapnel. These shards shredded his own heart and lungs. The governor watched, paralyzed. The invincible Commodore was hit by an invisible, cosmic hammer. Alistair's body jerked. He was a puppet on tangled, burning strings. His spine shattered in 12 places. His eyes rolled back. The capillaries burst into solid red orbs. The crew did not move to help. They had spent years fearing Alistair's wrath. Now they watched the blood spray across his white uniform. They watched their god turn into a heap of broken, twitching meat. The betrayal was silent but absolute. Not a single sailor reached out to catch him as he tumbled toward the deck. The vessel stood up. For the first time in 10 years, he stood up. His bones remained broken, held together only by the lingering residue of the contract. But the tether was dead. The blue light faded. Cold, hard clarity replaced it. He began to walk. Every step was a nightmare of friction and pain. He did not stop. He climbed the stairs. The wet slap of his bloody bandages was the only sound in the frozen air. He reached the deck. He walked past the governor, who was vomiting over the side. He walked past the crew. They knelt in terror as he approached the bow. He stopped in front of what remained of Alistair. The Commodore was still alive. His lungs whistled through the holes in his chest. He looked up at the vessel. His mouth worked silently. He begged for a mercy that did not exist in this ocean. The vessel looked down at the ivory cane. It was still clutched in the red stump of Alistair's arm. The gold cap reflected the cold light of the stars. "The ship is unharmed, Commodore," the vessel said. His voice was as cold as the ice surrounding them. "Just as you ordered." Alistair's left hand, the only part of his anatomy that remained recognizable, scratched at the silver deckboards. His ivory cane stayed wedged in the red pulp of his shattered forearm. The Commodore looked up at the vessel. His eyes bulged with a primitive reptilian terror. The god of the seas had evaporated. In his place lay a gutter rat, shivering in the freezing spray of the North Atlantic. He was drowning in the fluid of his own pulverized lungs. Every attempt at a breath resulted in a wet, gargling sound that vibrated through the silver wood. "Mercy," Alistair gurgled. A bubble of dark venous fluid popped on his lips, staining his gold-trimmed collar. The contract. Reconnect it. Heal me. You can take the damage. I will give you gold. I will make you a lord of the Admiralty. You will have everything." The vessel did not move. He stood over the ruin, his grey bandages flapping in the sub-zero wind. These rags were soaked through with the Commodore's high-born blood. He watched as Alistair tried to crawl. The Commodore's legs dragged behind him, 2 dead weights of shattered marrow and useless muscle. He reached out with a single trembling finger. He tried to hook it into the vessel's tattered hem. The man who had twisted ivory into an open wound was now whimpering for a second of relief. The vessel reached down. He did not use a gentle touch. He gripped the ivory cane. His fingers sank into the warm, sticky remnants of Alistair's bicep. He pulled. A wet, sucking sound, a final, agonizing squelch, echoed across the deck as the cane was ripped free from the Commodore's anatomy. Alistair let out a high, thin shriek. A violent cough of clotted blood cut the scream short. He collapsed against the soul wood he loved so much. He was nothing. He was a stain on a perfect ship. The vessel did not stop. He knelt beside the dying man. He took the gold-capped head of the ivory cane and hooked it under Alistair's upper eyelid. He pried the eye open, forcing the Commodore to witness the silver masts of Her Majesty's ship Argent Mother, silhouetted against the cold stars. "The debt is settled, Alistair," the vessel said. His voice was no longer a rasp. It possessed the terrifying clarity of a mountain spring. "You asked me to ensure the ship did not feel a thing. I obeyed. You asked me to increase the conductivity. I obeyed. I gave you the full weight of your own ambition. Now look at the sky you tried to own. See how little it cares for your rank. See how the ocean prepares to swallow your legacy." The governor stepped back. His boots slipped in the red frost coating the silver deck. Who are you?" he stammered. His voice trembled with the frequency of a dying candle. "You have murdered a hero of the Empire. You are a monster. Guards, seize this creature." The vessel turned his head. The blue glow in his eyes had died, replaced by a cold, hard void that made the governor's heart stop. He looked at the governor. Then he looked at the crew. Not a single sailor moved. The Royal Marines lowered their muskets. They saw the ivory cane in his hand. They felt the ship itself hum under his feet, recognizing its true master. This was not a mutiny. This was a physical eviction of a parasite. The Soulwood had chosen a new heart. The deep-sea scales began to chime in the distance. The ghostfish bells rang 10 times across the ice, a metallic knell that signaled the end of the transaction. The ocean had been paid in full. The energy had found its home. The ledger of pain was balanced. "The Commodore is a memory," the vessel announced. He did not shout. His voice carried to every corner of Her Majesty's ship Argent Mother, through the very vibration of the hull. "The contract is rewritten. This ship no longer requires a sacrifice. It requires a captain who knows the weight of the water. If any of you wish to join Alistair in his final descent, speak now." Silence met his words. The crew knelt, one by one. Their foreheads touched the cold silver wood. They did not kneel to a hero. They knelt to the man who had survived the impossible and turned it into a weapon. The vessel walked toward the helm. He leaned on the ivory cane. The gold cap remained smeared with Alistair's marrow. He did not wipe it off. It was his seal of office. It was the physical proof of his victory. He reached the wheel. For the first time in 10 years, he did not feel the pain of the ship. He felt its power. He felt the massive potential of 12,000 tons of silver wood waiting for his command. He turned the Argent Mother away from the ice, carving a path through the black water. Alistair's eyes remained open, staring at the freezing stars as the life drained into the silver deck. He died in the cold, surrounded by the luxury he had stolen from the blood of others. He was a broken vessel in a world that only valued the whole. The vessel did not look back. He steered the ship into the dark, the ivory cane clicking rhythmically against the silver deck, the only sound in a world that had finally gone quiet. Her Majesty's ship Argent Mother was no longer a vessel of the Empire. It was a phantom of the deep, and its master was no longer a dog.
Alistair thought he could outsource his pain, but seeing him turned into a literal red stain on his own silver deck was the most satisfying physical audit I've ever witnessed. If you had been the one in that Iron Throne for 10 years, would you have let him go that easily? Or would you have forced him to survive just to feel the weight of every wave he ignored? Between us, I originally planned to sink the ship with him, but letting the vessel keep the ivory cane felt like a much colder way to permanently erase Alistair's legacy.